Good morning. Page 433. His battle was utterly hopeless, and he knew it. No one could unravel that tangled skein. And if he had won hands down, it would have done nothing to improve the social order, the system. It would have been no more than a brief, vague gleam of hope in one narrow little spot, quickly swallowed by the clouds. Nothing that victory might bring could balance the risk of a rearrest, which was the price he might pay. Only the Khrushchev era saved Mitrovic. Yes, his battle was hopeless, but it is human to be outraged by injustice, even to the point of courting destruction. His struggle could end only in defeat, but no one could possibly call it useless. If we had not all been so sensible, not all been forever whining to each other, it won't help, it can't do any good. Our land would have been quite different. Mitrovic was not even a citizen, he was only an exile. But the district authorities feared the flash of his spectacles. They feared him, yes, but when election time came around, the bright day on which we elected our beloved democratic rulers, the difference disappeared between the intrepid warrior Mitrovic, which was his fighting spirit now. Where was his fighting spirit now? My non-committal self, and M, who was even more reserved, and on the face of it, in the most pliant of the three. The most pliant. We all alike concealed our suffering and our disgust, and took part in the festival of fools. Nearly all exiles had permission to take part in elections. They cost so little, and even those deprived of rights suddenly discovered themselves on the list and were hurried off to vote at the double. We did not even have voting booths in Cockturek. There was one box with undrawn curtains somewhere up a corner, so out of the way that it would have been embarrassing to make for it. Voting consisted in carrying the ballot forms to an urn as quickly as you could and tossing them in. Even stopping to scrutinize the candidates' names was enough to arouse suspicion. Why read them? Maybe you think the party organs don't know whom to nominate? When he had cast his vote, everyone was entitled to go boozing, drink his wages, or an advance, which would always be given at election time. Dressed in their best suits, they all, exiles included, exchanged solemn greetings, wishing each other a happy holiday. That's one good thing you could say for the camps. There were none of these elections. Once Cockturek elected a people's judge, a Kazakh, unanimously. Excuse me for a minute. Unanimously, of course. As usual, they congratulated each other on the great day. But a few months later, Judge was accused of criminal offense by the district in which he had previously dealt justice, unanimously elected there too. It turned out that Cockturek also he had already had time to line his pockets comfortably with bribes from private persons. Alas, they had to remove him and hold a by-election. Once more the candidate came from outside, a Kazakh whom nobody knew. On Sunday, the whole town, dressed in its best, voted early in the morning and unanimously. The same happy faces exchanged felicitations in the streets, without a twinkle in the eye. In hard labor camp, we had openly mocked at the whole farce, but in exile you must not be too ready to share your thoughts. The exile's life is like that of the free, of the first habit, and the first habit of free men he adopts is the worst, their reticence. M was one of the few with whom I could talk about such things. They had sent him here from Kazgan, and without a kopeck. His money had been kept back somewhere along the line. This did not worry the MVD in the least. They simply took him off the prison dole and turned him onto the streets of Cockturek to steal or die, just as he pleased. That was when I lent him 10 rubles and earned his gratitude forever. It was a long time before he stopped reminding me how I had saved him. One of his fixed characteristics was never forgetting a kindness, nor an injury either. He bore a grudge against Kudyev, for instance, the Chechen boy who had nearly fallen victim to a blood feud. But nothing stands still in this world. Kudyev, after his narrow escape, viciously and unjustly took out his spite on M's son. An exile with no professional qualifications, M could not find a decent job in Cockturek. The best that came his way was the post of assistant in the school labs, which he greatly prized. But his post required him to be at everyone's beck and call, never to answer back, never to have a mind of his own. He did keep his thoughts to himself. He was unreachable under his outward politeness, and no one knew the first thing about him, not even why, at nearly 50, he had no profession. He and I somehow became friendly. We never clashed, and quite often helped each other. Our reactions and our way of expressing them, acquired in the camps, were identical, so that although he kept quiet about it for a long time, I finally learned the carefully concealed story of his public and his private past. It is instructive. Before the war, he had been secretary of the district party committee at ZH during the war, and during the war was officer in charge of the cipher section of a division. He had always held high positions, always been a person of consequence, never experienced the petty troubles of lesser folk. Then one day in 1942, one regiment in the division did not receive the order to retreat in time, and the cipher section was to blame. The mistake had to be corrected, but it also happened that all M's subordinates had been killed or disappeared somewhere, and the General M himself, to the forward sector, into the jaws of the pincers, which were already closing on the regiment, ordered them to retreat, save them. M went on horseback, deeply distressed and fearing for his life. On the way he found himself in such danger that he decided to go no farther, and doubted whether he would survive even where he was. He deliberately stopped, abandoned the regiment to its fate, betrayed it, dismounted, threw his arms around a tree, or hid behind it from bursting shells, and solemnly swore to Jehovah that if he lived, he would be zealous in the faith and observe the holy law punctiliously. It all ended happily. Every man in the regiment was killed or taken prisoner, but M came out alive. He was sentenced to 10 years in a camp under Article 58, did his time, and here he was now in Cockturek with me. How rigorously he fulfilled his vow. His communist past had left no trace in his heart or in his mind. Only, when his wife tricked him into it, would he eat unclean fish without scales. He could not avoid coming to work on Saturdays, but endeavored to do nothing while there. At home, he rigorously observed all the rituals and prayed secretly as Soviet circumstances demand. Understandably, He revealed his story to very few people. To me, it doesn't seem so very simple. The only simple thing about it is something which people in our country are particularly reluctant to accept, that the innermost core of our being is religion and not party ideology. How are we to judge him? Under whatever code of law you like, criminal law, military law, the laws of honor, the laws of patriotism, and the laws of the party, this man deserved death or a blockade. He had destroyed a whole regiment to save his own life, not to mention his failure at that moment to hate, as he should, the most terrible enemy the Jews had ever had. But M could have appealed to some higher code of law and retorted, "Are not all your wars caused by the imbecility of politicians?" What made Hitler cut his way into Russia, if not imbecility, his own and Stalin's and Chamberlain's imbecility? And now you want to send me to my death? Was it you who brought me into the world? Some will object that he should have said this, and so then should all those in the doomed regiment on enlistment, when they were giving him a handsome uniform to wear, not out there with his arms around a tree. Logically, I had no intention of defending him. Logically, I ought to have hated him, despised him, felt sick when I shook hands with him. But I had no such feelings toward him, because I had not belonged to that regiment, not felt what it was like to be in their situation, because I had respected that 100 other factors had combined to decide their fate, because I had never seen M in his pride, but only when he was vanquished. Whatever the reason, we shook hands warmly and sincerely every day, and never once did I feel that there was anything disgraceful in it. One man can be bent into so many shapes in a lifetime, how different he may become, for himself as well as for others. And one of these different selves will readily, eagerly stone to death, obeying the order, the law, an impulse, or blind misconception. But what if this stone slips from your hand? What if you yourself are deep in trouble and begin to look at things with different eyes, at the crime, at the criminal, at him, and at yourself? In this thick volume we have pronounced absolution so often, I hear cries of astonishment and indignation. Where do you draw the line? Must we forgive everyone? No, I have no intention of forgiving everyone, only those who have fallen. While the idol towers over us, his commanding eminence, his brow creased imperiously, smug and insensate, mutilating our lives. Just let me have the heaviest stone, or let a dozen of us seize a battering ram and knock him off his perch. But once he is overthrown, once the first furrow of self-awareness runs over his face as he crashes to the ground, lay down your stones. He is returning to humanity unaided. Do not deny him this God-given way. After the places of exile described earlier, I have to admit that we in Kokhtarek and exiles in southern Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzia generally were privileged. They settled us in inhabited places, that is to say, where there was water and the soil was not altogether barren in the Chu Valley and the Kurdai district. It was indeed highly fertile. Very many of us landed in towns, Djambu, Chimkent, Talas, and even Alma-Ata or Frunze. Where lack of rights made no palpable difference between us and other townspeople who had rights. Food was cheap and work easy to find in these towns, and especially in industrial settlements, because the local population lacked all enthusiasm for industry, skilled trades, and intellectual occupation. But even those who ended in rural areas were not invariably driven into the kolkhoz. There were 4,000 people in our Kokturek, most of them exiles, but only some Kazakh sections of the town came under kolkhoz. The rest all managed to find jobs at the machine and tractor station, or took a normal job somewhere, even at a derisory salary, and lived on a quarter of a hectare of irrigated garden with a cow, some pigs, and some sheep. Significantly, a group of Western Ukrainians living among us in administrative exile after 5 years in the camps and working hard building boathouses for the local construction agency found life on the clay soil of Kokturek, which burned to dust unless it was heavily irrigated, but was at least not kolkhoz land, so much more comfortable than life on the kolkhoz in their beloved and flourishing Ukraine, that when the release order came, they all stayed in Kokturek for good. The security officers in Kokturek were lazy too, one instance in which the universal Kazakh laziness was beneficial. There were few informers among us, but we hardly noticed and came to no harm from them. The main reason for their inactivity, however, and for the steady relaxation of discipline was the onset of the Khrushchev era. Its impact, muffled by the jolts and wobbles along the way, had at least reached even us. There was a disappointment to begin with, the Varshalav amnesty, as the archipelago called it, although it was promulgated by 7 boyars. Stalin's cruel joke with the politicals on July 7, 1945, was a lesson which had not sunk in and was forgotten. Both in the camps and in exile, whispered rumours of an amnesty flourished. People have a remarkable capacity for pig-headed credulity. N.N. Grakova, for instance, a repeater with 15 years of hell behind her, kept a picture of clear-eyed Voroshalov on the wall of her little hut, and believed that a miracle would come for him. Well, the miracle came. It was in a decree signed by Voroshalov that the government enjoyed another laugh at our expense on March 27, 1953. Excuse me, so sorry. I must adjust. Sorry. Strictly speaking, it was impossible to invent any obvious and reasonable excuse for the grief-stricken rulers of a grief-stricken country to set criminals free just at that moment in March 1953, unless perhaps they were suddenly overwhelmed by a sense of the transience of all that is. True, though in ancient Russia too, so Kotoshikin tells us, it was the custom to release criminals on the day of the Tsar's internment, which incidentally was a signal for an orgy of looting. The Muscovites are not God-fearing by nature. They rob the male and the female sex alike of their garments in the street and beat them to death. This was just the same on this occasion. When, with Stalin in his grave, his successors were anxious for popularity, though their explanation connected the amnesty with the eradication of crime in our country. Who then were all those people inside? If it had been true, there would have been no one to release. Since, however, they were still wearing Stalinist blinkers, still slavishly thinking along the same old lines, they amnestied thieves and gangsters, but only those 58s with up to 5 years inclusive. The uninitiated, with the ways of decent governments in mind, might suppose that up to 5 years would enable 3/4 of the politicals to go home. In fact, only 1 or 2% of our kind had such childish sentences. The thieves were set loose upon the local inhabitants like locusts, and it was only some time later, and with considerable strain, that the militia reinstalled the amnestied bandits in their old reserve. The amnesty had interesting repercussions in our place of exile. There were some among us who had served a kid's sentence up to 5 years in their time, but then instead of being allowed to go home, had been exiled without trial. In Koktarac, this was true of certain very lonely old men and women from the western Ukraine and western Belarus, the meekest and unhappiest people in the world. They cheered up greatly after the amnesty and waited to be sent home, but some 2 months later came to the usual heartless clarification, inasmuch as they had been exiled, after having served their time in the camps and without trial, not for 5 years, but in perpetuity. The previous 5-year term of imprisonment which had led to their exile did not count, and they were not covered by the amnesty. Then there was Tanya Kazachek, a completely free woman who had come from the Ukraine to join her exiled husband. And had been registered as an exiled settler for the sake of tidiness. When the amnesty came, she rushed to the MPD post. They very reasonably retorted, "You didn't get 5 years like your husband. You're here indefinitely, so the amnesty doesn't affect you." Draco, Solemn, and Justinian, the lawgivers, would have burst with indignation. So no one got anything out of the amnesty. But as the months went by, and especially after the fall of Beria, by slow degrees, without fanfares, genuine realization began creeping into the land of exile. They allowed the 5-year people to go home. They began allowing the children of exiles to attend higher educational institutions in the vicinity. At work, they stopped addressing exiles with rude familiarity. Life was easier all the time. Exiles began to rise in their professions. Vacant desks were seen in the MPD post. That other officer, where is he? He doesn't work here now. The staff was being drastically reduced, thinned out. They started handling us more gently. The sacred duty to report ceased to be quite so sacred. If a man had not turned up by dinner time, never mind, next time will do. One national group after another had certain rights restored. Travel within the district was now unrestricted, and trips to other oblasts much freer. Rumors flew thicker and faster. They're going to let us go home. Sure enough, they let the Turkmen go, those who were exiled for having been prisoners of the war. Then the Kurds. Houses were put up for sale, and house prices tottered. They also released some elderly administrative exiles. People had pleaded their cause in Moscow, and lo and behold, they were rehabilitated. Excitement rippled through the exiles, leaving them feverish and confused. Shall we be on the move soon? Is it really possible? Ridiculous, as though that old regime could ever become any kinder. The camp had taught me to be consistent in my disbelief, and anyway, there was no special need for me to believe here in the great Russian heartland. I had neither family nor friends, whereas here in exile I was experiencing something like happiness. I doubt whether I had ever lived so comfortably. True, during my first year of exile, a deadly disease was tormenting me, as though it was in league with my jailers. And for a whole year, no one in Cocktrack could even determine what it was. I could hardly stand on my feet in front of my class. I slept badly and ate very little, all that I had previously written in the camp, and stored in my memory all that I had composed in exile since. I had to write down hastily and bury in the ground. I remember clearly that night before I left for Tashkent, the last night of 1953. It seemed as though for me life and literature was ending right there. I felt cheated. But my illness abated, and my 2 years of truly beautiful exile began with only one hardship, one sacrifice to cast a shadow. I dared not marry, because there was no woman whom I could trust with the secrets of my lonely life, my writing, my hiding places, but all my days were lived in a state of constant, blissfully heightened awareness, and I felt no constraint on my freedom. At school, I could give as many lessons as I wanted in both shifts, and every lesson brought a throbbing happiness, never weariness or boredom, and every day I had a little time left for writing, and there was never any need for me to attune my thoughts. As soon as I sat down, the lines raced from under my pen. On those Sundays, when we were not tortured out to thin beat in the kolkhoz, when we were not turned out to thin beat in the kolkhoz, I wrote without pause the whole Sunday through, and when I was there, I also began on a novel impounded 10 years later, and I had writing enough for a long time ahead. As for publication, that was not to be expected until after I was dead. By now I had some money, so I bought a little clay house for myself and ordered a firm table to write on, but I went on sleeping on the same old bare wooden boxes. I also bought a shortwave radio set, covered my windows at night, glued my ear to the silk over the speaker, and through the cascading crash of jamming, tried to catch some of the forbidden news we longed for, and to reconstruct from the general sense the parts I could not hear. We were so worn out by the decades of lying nonsense. We yearned for any scrap of truth, however tattered. And yet this work was not worth the time I wasted on it. The infantile West had no riches of wisdom or courage to bestow on those of us who were nurtured by the archipelago. My little house stood on the extreme eastern edge of the settlement. Beyond my gate there was an irrigation channel, the steppe, and the sunrise each morning. Wherever there was a puff of wind from the steppe, my lungs drank it in greedily. In the dusk and at night, whether it was dark or moonlight, I strolled about alone out there, inhaling and exhaling like a lunatic. There was no other dwelling line. There was no other dwelling less than 100 meters off, to left, to right, or to the rear of me. I was fully resigned to living there, if not in perpetuity, then for 20 years, at least. I did not believe that conditions of general freedom would come sooner, and I was not far wrong. I seemed to have lost all desire to go elsewhere, although my heart stood still when I looked at a map of central Russia. I was aware of the whole world, not as something beckoning to me from outside, but as something experienced and assimilated entirely within myself, so that nothing remained for me to do but write about it. I was replete. When Radishev was in exile, his friend Kutuzov wrote to him as follows: "It grieves me to tell you this, my friend, but your position has its advantages. Cut off from all men, remote Remote from all objects that dazzle us, you can all the more profitably voyage within yourself. You can gaze upon yourself dispassionately, and consequently form less biased judgments about things ever too previously looked through a veil of ambition and worldly cares. Many things will perhaps appear to you in a completely new aspect. Precisely so, and because I cherished the pure vision it gave me, I was fully conscious that exile was a blessing to me. Meanwhile, the shifts and stirrings in the exile world were more and more noticeable. The MPD officers became positively kindly, and their numbers were further reduced. The normal punishment for running away was now only 5 years, and even this was not imposed. One after another, national groups ceased reporting to the MPD, and then were granted the right to leave. Tremors of joy and hope disturbed our quiet exile. Suddenly, without hint or warning, yet another amnesty crept up on us. The Adenauer amnesty of September 1955. This was after Adenauer had visited Moscow and stipulated that Khrushchev should free all the Germans. No sooner had Nikita ordered their release than the absurdity of this situation, releasing the Germans and holding on to their Russian collaborators with 20-year sentences, was realized. But these were all police headmen appointed by the Germans, or Blastovites. No one was anxious to draw much public attention to that amnesty. Excuse me one moment. Sorry. And anyway, there is a general law on the dissemination of information in our country. Trivialities are shouted from the rooftops, important news stealthily leaked, so that the biggest of all political amnesties since the October Revolution marked no special day and was proclaimed on September 9th in a single newspaper. It's Vestia, and even there, on an inside page, with no comment whatsoever, not a single article to keep it company. How could I help being agitated? I read it. Amnesty for the persons who collaborated with the Germans. Where did that leave me? Apparently it did not apply to me. I had served in the Red Army throughout. To hell with you then. So much less to worry about. Then my friend LZ Koplev wrote from Moscow. He had flourished his amnesty in a Moscow militia station and talked them into giving him a temporary residence permit. Shortly after, they had sent for him. What's the idea? Trying to bamboozle us? You weren't a collaborator, were you? No. And you did serve in the Soviet Army? Yes. Right. Get the hell out of Moscow within 24 hours. He stayed where he was, of course, but after 9 in the evening, I'm on tenterhooks at every ring of the bell. I think they've come for me. I thought with pleasure how much better off I was once I'd hidden my manuscripts, and I did this every evening. I slept like a babe. From my clean desert I imagined the teeming, fretful, vainglorious capital, and felt no urge at all to go there. My Moscow friends, however, insisted. Why have you taken it into your head to stay there? Ask for a judicial review. They have started reconsidering cases. Why should I? Where I was, I could spend a whole hour watching the ants who had bored a hole in the mud brick foundations of my house, without foremen, warders, or commanders of camp divisions, carrying loads of husks for their winter store. One morning they suddenly failed to appear, although the ground outside the house was strewn with husks. As it turned out, they had anticipated long before. They knew that there would be rain that day, although the cheery sunny sky gave no warning. After the rain, the clouds were still heavy and black, but they crept out to work. They knew for sure that it would not rain again. There, in the silence of exile, I could see with perfect certainty the true course of Pushkin's life. His first piece of good fortune was his banishment to the south. His second and greatest his banishment to Mikhailovskaya. There he should have lived and gone on living instead of hankering for other places. What fatal compulsion drew him to Petersburg? What fatality prompted him to marry? Still, it is difficult for a human heart to follow where reason leads. Difficult for a wood chip not to sail with the pouring stream. The 20th Congress arrived. For a long time now, we knew nothing about Khrushchev's speech. They started reading it to some people in Tokhtarek, but kept it secret from the exiles, and we learned about it from the BBC. But Mikhail's words in an ordinary, open newspaper were enough for me. This was the first Leninist Congress. Since such and such a year, I knew that my enemy Stalin had fallen, which meant that I was on the way up, and so I applied for a review of my case. Then, in spring, they lifted sentences of exile from all 58. In my weakness, I abandoned my crystalline exile and went into the turbid outside world. The feelings of a former Zek as he crosses the Volga from east to west to travel all day in a clanking train over the wooden Russian plain do not form part of this chapter. In Moscow that summer, I phoned the public prosecutor's office to ask how my appeal was going. They asked me to call another number, and the cordial, unassuming voice of an interrogator invited me to look in at the Lubyanka for a chat. In the famous office of Kuznetsky, where Kuznetsky most, where passes were issued. They told me to wait, suspecting that somebody's eyes were already on me, studying my face. In spite of my inner tension, I put on a look of good-natured weariness and pretended to be watching a child who was playing, with no enjoyment at all, in the middle of the waiting room. Just as I thought, my new investigating officer was standing there, in civilian clothes, observing me. When he had satisfied himself that I was not a white-hot enemy, he came up and very amiably took me to the big Lubyanka. While we were still on the way, he was full of regrets that my life had been so horribly messed up. By whom? That I had been denied a wife and children. But the stuffy, electric-lighted corridors of the Lubyanka had not changed since I had taken through them with a shaved skull. Hungry, sleepless, buttonless, hands behind my back. What a brute of an investigator you got, that Yesipov. I remember his name. He's been demoted since. He was probably sitting in the next room and calling my man names. I was in counter-espionage, the naval branch of SMERS. We didn't have people like that. Ryumin was one of yours. You had Levchin and Libin. I nodded innocently. Of course you didn't. He laughed at my 1944 witticisms about Stalin. You put it very neatly. He praised the stories I had written up front, which were on the file as incriminating evidence. There's nothing anti-Soviet in them. Take them if you like, try to get them published, but I refused in a feeble, almost expiring voice. Heavens no, I've given up literature long ago. If I live another 5 years, another few years, my dream is to study physics. Seasonal camouflage. This is a game we shall play from now on. Spare the rod and spoil the man. Prison was bound to teach us something, if only how to behave in front of the KGB. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.